So we tend to approach the world saying, why am I right all the time? I'm going to figure out why I'm right. But the more useful thing is, why am I wrong? Because we already know why we're right. What we don't know is why we might be wrong. And that's actually what we're trying to uncover. And so that gets you to start doing that. So notice that once you say, do you want to bet? A couple things happen. The first thing is that I go, oh, wait a minute. I actually recognize that I'm not 100% sure about this. So it gets you to move into, to use the word zone again, a zone of uncertainty, which is a better place to be because it's a more accurate representation of the world. And then the other thing it does is it makes you really information hungry, because now I want to go find out, like, should I be betting? I got to go do my research.
That's former poker pro and champion and decision strategist Annie Duke, coming up next on the All Things Risk podcast. Welcome back, folks. It's great to be back with another episode of the All Things Risk podcast. My name is Ben Catania, your host. This is my show, my passion project, where in each episode we explore risk and uncertainty in what I hope is an interesting and eclectic way. We do that with some fabulous guests, and we have a great show for you today. And I've done 90 full episodes now. And as a podcast host, I know that it's a bit like children. You're not supposed to have favorites, but you inevitably do. And this one, I have to say, is one of my favorites, and I know is going to be one of my favorites for a long, long time. But before we get into it, let's quickly take care of some business. This episode is brought to you by Audible, the home for audiobooks. For my listeners in the UK or in the US, you can get a 30-day free trial and a free audiobook, which is yours to keep. Choose from over 180,000 titles, including that of my guest today, and get yourself something for your iPhone, your Android device, your Kindle, or your MP3 player. If you are in the US, go to audibletrial.com/all-things-risk. If you're in the UK, click on the link accompanying this episode. You can find that at allthingsrisk.co.uk. That's .co.uk. All right. Today, I have the pleasure of bringing you my conversation with Annie Duke. Annie is a decision scientist and a former professional poker player. In fact, for 2 decades, she was one of the best players in the world. In 2004, she beat a field of 234 players to win her first World Series of Poker Gold bracelet. And in 2010, she won the prestigious NBC National Heads Up Poker Championship. However, this is not an episode about poker. Well, it is and it isn't, because as you'll hear, the game of poker is a great metaphor for life, because poker is all about making decisions under conditions of uncertainty. And so this is an episode, a conversation about decision-making in life. In fact, Annie has a background in cognitive psychology. She received a National Science Foundation fellowship prior to her poker career, and she is now working in a variety of projects on decision science with the likes of Philip Tetlock, who is a giant in this field. And earlier this year, Annie's book was published. It's called Thinking in Bets, Making Smarter Choices When You Don't Have All the Facts. It's an excellent book. I certainly recommend it. And this is both a fun and very informative conversation that covers Annie's origin story as a poker player and her academic background and how that folded into her poker career, the concept of resulting in poker, which we apply in life, the concept of decision quality and why that's so important. And for this, Annie uses an example that's in her book. It comes from American football. It was the Seattle Seahawks head coach Pete Carroll's decision to throw a pass late in the game during Super Bowl 49 against the New England Patriots. And if you know nothing about American football, you ought to know that this decision was characterized as terrible after the match. It effectively cost the Seahawks the game. However, as you'll hear, and I don't want to spoil this part of the episode too much here, but it was actually a very good decision that just turned out badly. And Annie tells us why and how we do this a lot in life. And I've tried to find an analogous example, but I can't seem to find one that matches exactly, certainly not in terms of the magnitude of this Super Bowl 49 example of this concept. But we get into that, and we also discuss ways to make better decisions. We get into the importance of thinking in bets, as the title of Annie's book goes by. We get into the value of thinking in probabilities. We talk about loads of other great stuff. So let's get into it. Here is Annie Duke. Enjoy. Annie, welcome to the All Things Risk podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
This is going to be a fun conversation because I never realized how complicated a game poker is and how wonderful a game poker is. And I'm not a poker player, but we will get into all of that. But before we do, I'd love for you to just give my listeners a bit of a background to yourself and how you got into playing poker and winning lots of money playing poker.
Sure. So I have kind of an unusual origin story, I think, for a poker player, particularly a poker player at the time that I started playing, which was in the mid 90s. So I started my life off as an academic. I finished my undergraduate work at Columbia University, and I was off to graduate school at the University of Pennsylvania, and I was studying cognitive science. And getting my PhD in that. I was specifically studying first language acquisition, and went along my merry way. I was thinking I'm going to be a professor. I had a National Science Foundation fellowship to do my work. And during the last year, so in my 5th year of my program, I started struggling with some stomach issues that just were progressively getting worse. I went off to my first job interview to become a professor. I got really sick. I didn't actually make it to the interview because I ended up in the hospital. And I was in the hospital for 2 weeks, unable to keep any food down. So obviously, I was very sick, and I had to postpone all of these job interviews that I had lined up. And academics is a very seasonal job market. So once I kind of missed that season, between being in the hospital and recuperating, I needed to wait another year before I could go back out on the job interview, which was firmly my plan, by the way. I was going to recuperate, get better, and then go back out on the job market the next year. So during that time, I was recuperating, actually moved to Montana to recuperate. My husband at the time had his family live there. And so we went there for me to just sort of get some rest and try to really heal. And I found myself needing money because obviously I wasn't at school anymore. I couldn't teach. I didn't have my fellowship. So my brother, Howard Lederer, had already been playing poker for about 10 years by this time. And remember, this is kind of a weird time because in the 90s, poker was not on TV. And it's hard for people to remember that. Right around 2003, 2004, poker became really ubiquitous on TV. It seemed like whenever you turned whatever channel on, there was a poker tournament. But that was a full decade after I had started playing, and 20 years actually after my brother had started playing. So this was not a thing where people said, oh, why don't you become a professional poker player? What a great idea. I see it on television. But because my brother had already been playing, he had moved to New York in the 80s and was really, really into chess. and through chess had sort of found his way to poker and a little bit of backgammon, and that's how he had started playing. So here I am in Montana. I think I'm going to go back and, I'm fully planning to go back and do my PhD, and I need money. And my brother says to me, hey, why don't I teach you poker? And you can go off and start playing poker in the meantime in order to make some money while you're waiting to go back and finish your degree. Right. So that's what I did. And the meantime turned into 20 years. So, it was a weird path.
Sure. You have a background, though, if I read your background correctly, you grew up playing games, or your family did, or you played cards or something along those lines. Is that right?
Yeah, the poker thing wasn't completely out of the blue. So when I was growing up, most of my family time was card playing, although not poker. We weren't like, taking each other's money. Is that like your dad won my allowance money again? Yeah. We weren't actually betting any money, but we were playing games like Hearts. There's a game called Oh Hell, which is sort of a simpler version of Bridge.
Yeah, I love Oh Hell, yeah.
Yeah, it's a great game. I'm surprised you know it. That's awesome. So nobody knows what Oh Hell is. We'll have to play sometime.
You'll destroy me, but yeah.
Pretty good at that game. I played a lot of that game, and then I eventually started playing Bridge. I was my dad's Bridge partner. We played gin. It definitely had some card sense, I would say. And then when my brother started playing poker, actually when I was in graduate school, when I was at Columbia, he was playing poker in New York. He lived in New York, and I would sometimes come and sit and watch him play just to kind of hang out with him. So I had a little bit of a sense of the game. And then when I was in graduate school, he used to bring me out to Las Vegas once a year for a vacation while he was playing in the World Series of Poker. And he was just treating me to a vacation. I was a graduate student. My fellowship was $13,000 a year. There was no vacationing for me. Yeah. So he would fly me out, and I would stay at the Golden Nugget, and he was playing poker tournaments all the time. And it's kind of boring to watch poker if you can't see the whole card. So I was just kind of bored. And so he said, well, why don't you play a little bit of poker, while you're on vacation? And I remember this is a story that's in my book. I said, well, I don't really know how to play. He said, well, you watched me play, so you certainly understand the rules of the game. And when I would sit behind him, he would let me see his whole card. So I understood some about his decision making. And he wrote a list of hands I was allowed to play on a napkin with a Keno crayon. And we were sitting in a coffee shop at Binion's Horseshoe Casino, and he wrote this list on a napkin, like I say, and I just went over clutching the napkin with my list. So then about once a year when he would bring me out on vacation, I would play poker. And that was the whole of my experience. But, I had a lot of cards in my background, but obviously I was still a novice.
Well, what's interesting is you somehow married your academic background with poker playing. When did you realize that, hey, I can play this game really well?
Never.
Okay.
That's the real answer. Is
right,
never. It depends on what you mean by play the game well. Could I play the game better than a lot of the opponents that I was facing? A lot, but certainly nowhere near all. Yes. Okay. I did definitely get to that point. And that happened relatively quickly for me because I was playing in Montana. It was a pretty small stakes game. And my brother, by that point, he'd already been playing for 10 years, and he had this amazing learning group. It was like a study group that he was working with that had Eric Seidel, who now has over $38 million in tournament winnings. He's one of the greatest players of all time. He's a Hall of Famer. A guy named Dan Harrington, who has won the main event of the World Series of Poker. He is also a Poker Hall of Famer. And he was obviously interacting with them before they went on to become these legendary players. But that, my brother ended up with, two WPT championships, a couple of World Series of Poker bracelets, a Hall of Fame championship, and he's no slouch himself. And this was quite a study group. So he'd already been playing for 10 years. He'd already made the final table of the World Series of Poker, and I had him coaching me. And I was playing against people who were playing small stakes. They weren't they were trying to learn the game, but they certainly didn't have the resources that I did. So,
Okay.
relatively quickly, I kind of realized I was probably better at the game than them. But that's very different than feeling like you're good at poker, which is this incredibly complex game. I mean, it's really, really high pressure decision making. You know, you really have very little to work on. You can't see your opponent's hole cards. There's all this luck involved. It's very hard to see through to what the optimal play is in any situation. And, it's just, you're sort of a mess in the face of the game. But I think that balance is actually what's important for, I'm not sure how you can really, really become a lot better at it, at something as complex as poker, if you don't recognize that you're terrible at it. And I was terrible at it. So.
Right. I want to get into that, and we will in a moment. But when did that shift and poker become, so prevalent on television? What happened there?
Yeah, so that was about 9 years probably into when I started playing. So I became a pro in 94. And then in 2003, somebody figured out that there was a way to make poker interesting to watch. So prior to that, they would occasionally, they'd occasionally come and film poker, and, they would just have a camera on the game as if you were sort of standing by the table and watching the game. So notice that would put you as a viewer in an inferior position to the player. I mean, the player's not in a great position in regards to the cards because they only know their own cards. But that's obviously a big deal. Like when I was sitting behind my brother and he would let me peek his hole cards as he was playing a hand, it was really fascinating because I got to sort of see what his decision making was as he was guessing at what everybody else had. But prior to 2003, the viewer was in a worse position than the player, or than say I was when I was sitting behind my brother, because they couldn't see any of the cards. And when that's the case, poker's like super duper boring to watch.
Right.
So somebody figured out first, there was a guy named Henry Ornstein who figured out first that you could put a little glass square where the player is sitting, and the players could put their cards on the glass and there could be a camera underneath it. So now that camera could see the whole cards. And then somebody else came along with these little like lipstick cameras, these shrunken down cameras, and they figured out how to put it into the edge of the table so that now when a player looked at their whole cards, in other words, they pulled up the backs of them, the camera could also see that. Now what that meant is that the viewer would be in a superior position to the player. So the player can see their own cards, but nobody else's.
Right.
Now the viewer had access to everybody's cards in the hand, and that actually made poker very exciting to watch. And that is when it started to explode. And the first year that the World Series of Poker was on television, a very lucky thing for the game happened, which is this guy named Chris Moneymaker, which is the greatest name ever.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
Actually won the main event of the World Series of Poker. And Chris Moneymaker was somebody who had been playing on a poker site called Poker Stars. And he had won a satellite. He paid somewhere around $40 or something to win the satellite to get a $10,000 entry into the World Series of Poker, at which he won, a couple $1 million. So it was this real, like, amazing story of, $40 in a tournament to win your buy-in, to win $2 million, this unknown guy against all of these pros. And it was amazing for poker because, first of all, it let people know, like, you could get into these tournaments for a very little amount of money, and everybody sort of had this lottery dream. I'm going to go buy my ticket for $1 and maybe I'll become a millionaire. And then the other thing is that it really let people know that poker is this very particular game where someone can be less experienced than the people that they're playing against, and they can get lucky.
Sure. Yeah.
It's really an attractive thing. So after that happened, it was called the moneymaker effect. Like poker exploded.
I can see how that would be very compelling. from a viewer's perspective, because you can see all the hands and you just wonder, I wonder what this guy's going to do, I wonder what this player's going to do, and how that will play out. And it can be, if you follow the game like anything, I'm sure it makes it very compelling viewing.
Well, it's kind of interesting because it also gives the viewer, I mean, this is kind of a good and bad thing. I mean, in terms of growing the game, I think it's a good thing. Mm-hmm. In terms of the viewer's own ability to sort of like learn, I think it's a bad thing. But
okay.
In terms of growing the game, it's an amazing thing because again, the viewer's in this superior position to the player. And when you see somebody's hole cards, what the correct play is seems obvious.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But that's different. Like when players are actually making the decisions, they can't see the whole card, so it's not so obvious. So like, oh my gosh, you should have bluffed there.
Right,
How could he be so dumb that he didn't bluff there? Well, the reason why he could be so dumb and not bluff, or the reason why why did you fold that hand? You had the best hand. Well, because they didn't know that the other person had the cards that they had and they were guessing at it. So it actually makes it feel like a much easier game to play.
I see.
Than it actually is, which is great because it gets people, it gets people to start playing. And I can, like the year that Moneymaker won, I think there were, I think it was 839 players entered the $10,000 buy-in main event of the World Series of Poker the year he won. Mm-hmm. The very next year, it was over 2,000 players. Mm. So that shows you what that did for the game. I mean, it was crazy.
Yeah, well, it also, and we'll get into this, but it's also, I guess, creates a form of hindsight bias, right? And you talk about that. It's very similar to in your book when you talk about the Seattle Seahawks Super Bowl play. And so maybe let's transition to that for a moment. And,
I'm so happy that you linked that up, by the way, because it is the exact same problem. I mean, once you see the whole cards, you know the outcome of the hand, right?
Right. Yeah. So. Well, I love to watch sport, and one of the great things about watching sport is you don't know what the outcome is going to be. I mean, otherwise, why watch it? You can I can't even watch, like if I tape a sporting event and I just know that there's an answer already, I have trouble watching it. Right, exactly.
Like I try during Wimbledon, I do that, and I really try to keep myself away from the result because otherwise it's no fun to watch.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly, and that's why we love to watch it, and that's why we love uncertainty. But it creates all of these these sorts of traps. But I don't see the viewing experience, as you describe it in terms of poker, all that different from watching any other sport. I'm thinking about, we just had the World Cup of soccer. We call it football over here. But when you watch a match, it's what the teams are trying to do is they're trying to get into positions where they increase the probability of scoring a goal. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about this as I was listening to your audiobook on the Seattle Seahawks play, and that was just that in the sport of football or soccer, we have once every 4 years 1 month where all the countries play, and then whoever wins is the world champion. Well, it's kind of unfair in some respects because in leagues you have every team playing every team twice, once at home, once and away. And a team gets 3 points for a win and 1 point for a draw. And at the end of that, you are the champion of that country's league. And that to me feels, that's whoever wins that is clearly the champion. But in a World Cup match, if two teams are going to play and one team might only win 10% of that time, but they get the 10%, then it's pretty bad luck for that team, even though they might be the superior team.
Yeah, actually, so there was an interesting, I just wrote about this in my newsletter. So UBS did an analysis of the World Cup.
Yes.
And what they found was that 24% of the time Germany would win in their simulation, which obviously makes, in that case, like Germany is a prohibitive favorite, but only in comparison to the other team.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. So 76% of the time
they won't win. Yeah.
They won't win.
Yeah.
So they now put out this simulation. They say 24, our simulation says 24% of the time Germany will win. And of course Germany doesn't. And the headline was, this was in Bloomberg of all places. The headline was, UBS was wrong.
You're right. Yeah.
They predicted Germany would win and Germany's out. And it's like,
no, that's not what they were saying.
Literally could have just as easily been UBS was right. They said 76% of the time,
yes,
Germany wasn't going to win. And look, they didn't win. So
absolutely.
I think that what you're getting at is this issue of, first of all, like, how do we understand probabilities? What does it mean when we say, something's going to happen 10% of the time, and 90% of the time it's not going to happen? So now what tends to, what sort of happens in our brains is that when that thing that occurs 10% of the time happens, we sort of default it to 100%. We sort of go out to the edges of, you're telling me right or wrong. So you told me that 90% of the time, this thing wasn't going to happen. So the fact that it did means you were wrong. Well, of course it doesn't mean you're wrong. It just means that something that was going to happen 10% of the time occurred 10% of the time.
That's right. Yeah.
So what you're kind of getting at with the difference between the World Cup and regular season play, and you can actually see this in America in the difference between, say, football and Major League Baseball, which is that when you have a sport where there isn't a perfect connection between the relative skill of the team and the actual outcome of the game, right? So you can have a team whose relative skill in general is worse. They're less skillful, but they can win that particular game. Depending on how loose that connection is, you need more games in order to have the skill differential actually play out.
Yes.
So this is what you're talking about, is that the World Cup is kind of weird because it's these sort of, you play one match and then you play one match, and it's not sort of over the course of a season where you're playing a lot of different teams a lot of times, and you're playing teams that are in your league twice, and so on and so forth, where you can allow those skill gaps to actually sort of shine through in some sense. And you can see this in America. The National Football League has 16 games in a season, where the Major League Baseball has hundreds.
Yes.
So, there's another difference, right? Where football is going to be more luck, there's going to be more luck involved than, say, for example, in the NBA, there's much less luck involved in the way that turns out than in football. So we get this problem all the time. And, you could see this with kind of what happened with the Germany thing, which was that UBS said that Germany, in comparison to the other teams, would be most likely to win. And people defaulted to
picking Germany
they're telling me Germany's going to win. Yeah. And it's this problem that we have with thinking probabilistically, which actually really gets in the way of good decision making, because, once you have Bloomberg declaring UBS was wrong, we're all in really big trouble.
Yeah. And this is why in your book you talk about how life is like poker. It's not like chess. Could you explain that a little bit more for my listeners?
Sure. So I opened the book up with this concept called resulting. And that it's basically what we just talked about. It's, sort of working backwards from the result to say something about the quality of the decision, right? So the example I give is actually from American football, where the Seahawks are playing the Seattle Seahawks are playing the New England Patriots in the Super Bowl, and they're down by 4, and the coach of the Seahawks, a guy named Pete Carroll, calls for a pass play, and they're down by 4. It's the last play of the game, and there's only 26 seconds left in the game. So this is all or nothing here. He calls for a pass play. The ball is intercepted in the end zone, so that means the game is over. The New England Patriots win, and everybody screamed that Pete Carroll made a terrible decision. So what happened there was, we know it was a terrible outcome. The play didn't work. It ended the game with the Patriots winning. That's obviously the worst outcome for the Seattle Seahawks. So we know it was a really bad outcome. But what ended up happening was that people worked backwards from that bad outcome to declare that the decision itself was bad. And this is a little bit kind of what Bloomberg did in its headline, right? So UBS went through some sort of process in terms of determining what the probability of Germany winning was, they said that Germany was the favorite. When Germany lost, Bloomberg then took the fact that they lost to work backwards to say that their prediction that Germany was the favorite was bad. Mm-hmm. Right? But we know that 76% of the time that's going to occur. So it's actually doesn't tell you anything about whether Germany was the favorite. It just tells you that Germany lost that one time. And this is true for the Seahawks too. The probability of an interception in that particular spot on the most conservative measure that you could come up with is only about 2%. So it's only going to end in this disastrous result 2% of the time. 90%, 98% of the time, it's going to end up in some other way. So just on that basis alone, it's like, it seems a little weird to say that the decision was bad and that it wasn't just bad luck.
Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry. No, I was just thinking, for my listeners who may not follow NFL or American football, when I was listening to what you were talking about in your book, I thought, yeah, that decision makes total sense, because if, as you say, only a 2% chance, so 98% of the time they will, they'll score, or it will be, say, an incomplete pass. And the way that the clock works in that game, it meant that if that was the case, it was, say, an incomplete pass, then they would get 2 more attempts to win the game. So what the coach was doing was giving them 3 attempts to win the game from where they were, as opposed to if they didn't call that play, they would probably only get 2 attempts.
Correct. And you're paying kind of a 2% chance of this bad thing happening in order to get 3 chances instead of 2. Exactly. So here's the general problem that we have as decision makers. When we're making a decision prospectively, we're making a decision about a set of possible futures that can occur. But we know that only one possible future can happen, right? So there's all these possible futures that can occur, and then as the future unfolds, only one of those paths actually happens. So what we're trying to do as decision makers is try to figure out, how do I make a decision that's going to get me across the set of possible futures, kind of the highest probability of a good result. Now, what we know is that in that set, there are some bad things, right? There are some bad futures that are going to occur. We can't protect ourselves against, the interception, right? I can make really, really good decisions, say, in driving. I can drive on the right side of the road. I can make sure my car is in good repair. I can follow all the rules of the road. I can only go through green lights. And so that's obviously improving the set of possible futures for me. But among those futures is somebody, coming through the intersection the other way and hitting me. And I can't do anything about that. And if I get hit, it doesn't mean that my decisions were poor.
Sure.
But that's what we do. That's how we act. Once a future occurs, we act as if that was the only possible future. And then we use that to work backwards to whether the decision was good. And the reason that we do that is because most decisions don't have as much consensus around them as whether we follow traffic laws. Most decisions are actually quite hidden from view. Mm-hmm. So Pete Carroll's decision there for the Seahawks, it's really hidden from view, sort of what the mathematics of that decision are. And when in any game that's true, right? Whether you're watching soccer or you're watching tennis, we can't see through to the player's decision process. So we're sort of guessing at it. So, for example, when somebody has a free kick in soccer, whether the goalie goes right, stays in the center, goes left. Well, when the goalie dives left and the player actually hits it to the right side of the goal, it's very hard not to say that the goalie made a bad decision there.
Right.
Except we don't know that the goalie made a bad decision because he's making a guess and we don't know what he sees. And, it could be a perfectly good decision that had a bad result because at the last minute or whatever it might be, but we connect those together very tightly. So this is why poker is such a better model for decision making than something like chess. Mm-hmm. And it really has to do with this resulting problem, this working backwards problem. So if we think about chess, if I play a game of chess against you, and the only thing that somebody knows is that I lost the game to Ben, that's all they know. What do they know about my decision making relative to yours?
Well, it's fairly absolute, or it is relative. I mean, you've made a mistake somewhere along the lines, I suppose.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So in chess, I can work backwards from the outcome. If you tell me what the outcome was, I lost to Ben, we can say something about what my decision making was relative to yours. We know it was worse. So, and that's because chess has very little uncertainty. There's very little luck involved in the game. I mean, certainly not in the sense that someone rolls, a dice and the dice comes up 11 and now my bishop gets pulled off the board or something, right? Mm-hmm. And there's really no hidden information because I can see the whole position. So any move is, I can calculate it out.
Right. It'd be totally different if you blocked off a quarter of the board, for example.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. That would be very different.
Yeah.
Right. But now let's think about poker. Let's say that we play a hand of poker and I lose the hand to you. What do we know about my decision making relative to yours?
You could have made a good decision or it could have been luck.
Right. So we don't know. We have no idea. So I could have the very best hand. I could play the hand perfectly and I could still lose. And here's the interesting thing, and this is the sort of flip side of this that people don't think about so much, but it's equally problematic. I could have a very bad hand, I could play it poorly and still win. And you have to really sort of settle yourself into both of those. So people tend to think about, I had such a great position, I had the best hand, I made great decisions, I'm so unlucky. Mm-hmm. People think about that sort of side of the equation a lot. But they don't think a lot about, I played so badly, I had such a bad hand and I still won. And they don't think about that as big a disaster, but it actually is. So,
because then it will condition the way you look at the next game.
Exactly. That's exactly right. So, so what's interesting there is that we know that in poker, whether you win or lose the hand is a very poor signal for whether you've made good decisions. And it's actually more like what we were saying in terms of the difference between, say, American, Major League Baseball, where you play hundreds of games in a season, and football, American football, where you play 16 games in a season. One hand is not enough to tell you anything. Like, you have to play thousands and thousands and thousands of hands before we would really know what the skill differential is between us. Now, once we get in those hands, that skill differential will realize, but we've got to get a lot of hands in before we can get there. One hand doesn't tell you anything. So what that means is that this sort of resulting shortcut, this heuristic we use in order to try to reveal decision quality, because we can't, it's hard to see what, the quality of somebody else's decision is. This heuristic we use, which is, let's take the quality of the outcome and we'll work backwards to the quality of results. That only works if you're doing something where those two things are really tightly connected, where there isn't a lot of uncertainty. But in anything where there's a lot of uncertainty, like poker, or frankly, most of the decisions that you make in life, working backwards from the results is really bad. And it's because of two forms of uncertainty. We've talked a lot about the luck element, but there's also hidden information, right? I can't see the player's cards. So if we're like, for example, if we're in a negotiation against, where we're negotiating against each other, there's usually information on asymmetry. There's going to be things that I know that you don't know. And likewise, there's going to be things that you know that I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I wanted to touch on one aspect as well, and that is, you talk about heuristics, and I love this concept of decision quality, but sometimes that decision quality suffers because of social pressures or just this is how it's done. I'm thinking about sports again. When you in American football, when you should punt, and there've been some studies and papers that coaches punt the ball more often than they should, and so on. But similarly, there are all kinds of big decisions that we make. It might mean buying a house, or it might mean whether or not to accept a certain job, and we kind of have to be in a place of being very objective and rational, and we need to recognize when the kind of the social pressures of we wouldn't want to go for it on 4th and 2 at our own 20-yard line or something like that. The equivalent of that in real life. How do you think we can get better at recognizing some of those traps in making decisions?
Yeah. So first of all, oh my gosh, thank you so much for asking me that question because this happens to be the thing that's been most on my mind as I'm considering whether I want to write another book. It would be on
Okay.
exactly this
Yeah.
topic. So let me go back to this Pete Carroll problem. I mean, you mentioned this punting issue in American football, right? That we know that coaches in general do not go for it enough on the fourth down. They tend to punt to their mathematical disadvantage. So
Yeah.
what's going on here?
There's a
So
similarity in for anyone who likes ice hockey, when to pull the goalie, the goalkeeper.
mhm.
When there was a wonderful podcast by Malcolm Gladwell when he talks about this problem, pulling the goalkeeper problem, and we and in hockey is the same thing that you pull the goalkeeper much early. You should pull the goalkeeper much earlier if you're losing the match than
Mhm.
what is commonly done. But what happens is folks just, coaches just do what they commonly do or what's expected of them.
Yeah, that's a general. By the way, that's generally true. That when you're in a losing position, you should always be willing to take on more risk. Um, and people tend to actually, when they're losing, take on less risk, which is kind of interesting. But so let's talk about the sort of the Pete Carroll play in the Super Bowl is actually very revealing of this problem. And then I think that we can get to what causes people to make this mistake, and it wraps back into this resulting problem. So I talk about in Thinking in Bets this one thought experiment, and this is what I focus on. And you can think about this as a retrospective problem, right? You have an outcome. How do you determine whether the decision that led up to the outcome was good? So this is a working backwards problem, and this is what I'm focused on in that book. So what I say is, okay, so he passed the ball got intercepted, disaster. Obviously, every single headline was that was the stupidest call in the history of football. And I asked people in that book to do a thought experiment. Imagine if the ball were caught for a touchdown. What do you think that what the headlines would have been? And, it's very easy to feel quickly that the headlines would have been, he's a genius. That's
Mm-hmm.
why he got to the Super Bowl in the first place with his crazy decision making. Okay. So that's that retrospective thought experiment. But there's another thought experiment you can do that gets to exactly what you're asking about. So we know that the conventional play, the expected play would have been to hand the ball off to their running back. Their running back was a guy named Marshawn Lynch. And that was the expected play. Hand it off to Marshawn Lynch. They're only 1 yard away from the goal. Have him try to run through the Patriots defense and get into the end zone. So I have this other thought experiment, which is, okay, imagine that Pete Carroll had called for this run play. He had handed off to Marshawn Lynch. Marshawn Lynch fails to get in. He hands it off to Marshawn Lynch again. Marshawn Lynch fails to get in, and the Patriots lose. What do you think the headlines would have looked like the next day?
Yeah, same thing.
They would have just been like, oh, the Patriots were too good.
Yeah, right.
The
It wasn't
defensive line
right.
was too good.
Right.
What's interesting with that is if he does the expected thing, so this is like, for example, punting on fourth down. If he punts on fourth down, if he hands it off, which is the expected way to go,
and they lose anyway, then at least he saves
cares.
Face. Right.
Nobody cares. Nobody's yelling at Pete Carroll. Nobody's telling him he's a terrible coach. They're like, it was a close game. Good try.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They were just too good.
Yeah.
What are you going to do? It's the Patriots. So what I think is really interesting is that, so now we have a prospective problem, which is what this gets to with you. So now we can kind of understand, why is it that people take the safer choice? And what does the safer choice mean? The safer choice means the one where there is consensus already around the quality of the decision.
Mm-hmm.
So when you do something that's unexpected, that's innovative, where it's not kind of like settled, then people don't really know whether the decision was good or bad, or at least they feel like they don't know whether the decision was good or bad. So now they take the quality of the outcome and they say, well, that tells me whether the decision was good or bad. But if you've got something where it's sort of settled, like settled science, right, or settled math or a settled decision, and that's the choice that you make, Now, when there's an outcome, people allow the uncertainty, the kind of luck element, to bubble up to the surface, and they allow that as an explanation. So instead of criticizing the consensus choice, they just allow that luck was the problem. Now, what does that end up doing to us? That ends up making people say, well, I'm going to choose the consensus choice because I don't want to be blamed when it's a bad outcome. I don't want to get the PTO treatment. I don't want there to be 5 headlines from my boss the next day, or my spouse, or, my friend saying that was the stupidest decision anybody's ever made simply because I had a bad outcome. What I want to do is make a decision where if it turns out poorly, I can reasonably say, well, look, but we agreed. Like, we've all agreed on that decision. It was just luck. So what does it end up doing? So now we can think about it as a prospective decision. It puts people in a defensive crouch in their decision making where they're trying to fend off this resulting problem, and they're trying to let the uncertainty kind of like be their friend. And you can only do that if you're making decisions where you happen to be driving through green lights, right? Where we already know whether that's a good or bad thing. And that's terrible. So if you ask yourself, well, why is it that even though there's lots and lots and lots of really good analytics available around, say, these 4th down decisions or these pulling the goalie decisions, and we know what the analytics are, why is it that people are unwilling to do it? Well, it goes back to, who was it? Was it Charlie Munger who said people would rather fail conventionally?
That's possible. I can't remember
I can't remember who said it, but there's
something like that.
I'd rather fail, people would rather fail conventionally.
Yes.
And that's really where it kind of comes in, because if a coach pulls a goalie early and loses the game.
11 to 3 or whatever. Then it's.
People are going to be like, how could you, that was the worst decision. And what's going to happen to them? They're going to get fired.
Yes.
That's what's going to happen to them if they're getting fired.
Yes. So how can we get around that? We talk about decision quality. I love that term. How can we make sure that we're making a quality decision and not focusing so much on the outcome?
Oh my gosh, let me count the ways.
All right.
So let me just start with this. I think that this is really important to start with, is that you're never going to be particularly good at it. So I sort of relate this to you asking me, like, when did you realize you were really good at poker? And my answer was never. So just understand, like, your brain works the way it does. And these tendencies, like I know this Pete Carroll problem, and I can still feel in my gut that I feel like it was like a worse decision if the ball gets intercepted. It's just that I can stop myself and sort of like right the ship. So one thing that we want to realize is that what we're trying to do is not somehow become perfectly rational actors. That's just incredibly.
You can't.
Yeah.
Nobody's like that unless we lose our humanity, right?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So what you're trying to do is get a little bit better at it, right? A little bit better than older versions of yourself, previous versions of yourself. So try to improve on what you used to do. And, if you're in a competitive environment, if you're competing against somebody for sales or whatever it might be, like, get a little bit better than the people that you're competing against. So the way that I try, I would sort of put it is, I would think about, like, old Annie, before she was trying to think about this resulting problem, was maybe doing a really good job in terms of looking at the outcomes that she was having at the table, 5% of the time. And maybe new Annie is doing that 10% of the time. So I can look at that as new Annie's like an abject failure because she's missing 90% of the stuff that she could be looking at to win. Or I can look at it as new Annie is doing twice as good as old Annie. And that's the way that you should be looking at it, I would say. So new Annie's going to crush old Annie in her learning curve, which is really what you're trying to do, is this constant improvement. So I just want to sort of get that out there as, don't think that you're going to be perfect. The other thing that's really important to get out there is don't walk away from this saying, well, Annie and Ben had this great conversation about resulting, so now I know about it, so now I won't do it. Because by the way,
we'll all do it.
Yeah, you'll all do it.
Yeah.
So there's a couple of ways. There's a bunch of ways that you can really sort of help yourself with this problem and not get so caught up in the quality of the outcome and start to get more focused on the process, how good the decision was, what the quality of the decision was. And the first thing I would say is it really helps to have other people in on it with you. So the more that you can have other people helping you out to really kind of like check your bias, hold you accountable to not focusing so much on outcomes, hold you accountable to your process in a variety of ways. So, for example, one of the things that we do for ourselves is that when we have a really good result, we sort of have this tendency to assume that, we just did a good job. I mean, this goes back to I can play a hand that's not so great. I can play it pretty poorly and I can still win. What we tend to do in our own lives is we win and then we say, look at how great I played, without considering the possibility that might have been due to luck, for example. And it's good to have other people kind of checking you on that and probing that for you. Probing when you're complaining about something really horrible that happened, about how much was luck and how much was skill, getting you to focus on how you can change the quality of your decision, which is the thing that you can change. If you can change the quality of your decisions, you'll have better results going forward. And to help you not just ruminate on the things that have happened in the past, which is not particularly productive. So getting other people sort of in on the joke, holding you accountable to the biased ways in which you might think, pointing you in a better direction that you're thinking about your own decisions is going to be really, really helpful. And that's mainly because, and I'm sure that you know this too, like when you're talking to other people, you can see the bias in their thinking so clearly, in a way that you can't really see it in yourself. So that's why it's kind of nice to have other people involved, because they can see your bias a lot more clearly that you can see your own. So that's helpful. So that's kind of number one, is go find some friends, some coworkers. You only need 2 other people. It's good to have a group of 3. There's something really special about 3. So, make sure you've got at least 3 people and, work together to think through your decisions, work together to say, should we have pulled the goalie? And whatever that is in your own life, that goalie pulling is in your own life. So that's kind of the first thing. The second thing, and I think that this is very counterintuitive for people because everybody talks about being results oriented. But what people really mean by that is long-term results oriented, and they confuse that with short-term results oriented, right? So to your point, if you've got enough games in the season, then it's fine to be results oriented because you've allowed.
Yeah, the winner will win. The result will be what it should be. Yeah.
Right. But in the World Cup, maybe not so good to be results oriented, right? And the fact is that most of the decisions that we're making, most of the things that we're doing, we're playing the World Cup. We don't have enough outcomes to really say something meaningful about what our decision quality is on any given decision. So the thing that we really want to do is start to try to really separate ourselves from the outcome, start to not take the outcome so much into account. And that's actually the way to get through to decision quality. So how do you do that, right? That's the big question. Well, step number 1, as often as you possibly can, really go through a really good analysis of the decision that you're making before you get an outcome. That's a really good thing to do. Before the outcome ever happens, try to work through what the decision tree looks like. And in particular, the thing that you want to do is think about, for the decision that's under consideration, what do I think the possible outcomes might be? Write those down. What are those possible outcomes? And then try to assign, as best as you possibly can, a guess at the probability of each of those outcomes. Now, it's not going to be exact, right? Like, it might be, I think this outcome is going to happen between 30 and 70% of the time. And that might feel kind of unsatisfying because you might feel like you haven't come up with a right answer. And what I would say is, but get out of the idea that there's right and wrong, because guessing it between 30 and 70% of the time is better than not trying at all. For one thing, 30 to 70% of the time is a narrower range than I didn't even try. That's number one. And number 2, by making that guess, you end up with a drive to try to narrow that range down. Like, oh, what if I could get it to between 40 and 60% of the time? I'd be in a lot better shape.
Right.
And now you start to think about that uncertainty, which has to do with information asymmetry. And you start to become very information hungry. You start to think, what's the information I could go find that would help me to narrow that range down? And you particularly start to get very focused on other perspectives, going and asking other people what they know. Go try to find out the things that you don't know. Go try to ask why you might be wrong, because that's the information that really helps you narrow those ranges down. So if you do that, prospectively. I'm thinking about a decision. Here are the different futures that I think might happen, the different scenarios that could occur. I'm making a stab at those probabilities, and now I'm deciding what my best decision is, what's going to sort of get me to the best place on average, what's going to make it so that I'm like Germany and I have the best chance of winning. Now, when things don't go so well, you can look back at that work that you did and you can say, oh, well, look, I didn't win, but I'm like Germany, 76% of the time I wasn't supposed to. I'm not going to overreact to that. I'm not going to get so upset about it.
There's a term I sometimes use in the work that I do called I call it the zone of disappointment versus the zone of regret. So the zone of disappointment is, well, yeah, it was the adverse 76% or whatever. That's what happened. We did the analysis, etc. And the zone of regret is, I had no idea. I should have seen that coming. Blindsided me, but now I feel miserable, kind of a thing.
That's I love that term. Can I borrow that from you?
Absolutely. Really yeah. I grabbed it from someone else. So so please do. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's exactly right. Is that what this helps you do is stay in the zone of disappointment. I'm sad that, 80% of the time something great was supposed to happen and I'm sitting in the 20%. But I don't regret the decision that I made. Because once you get into that, first of all, you get into a really bad emotional place. And second of all, you'll tend to overreact and start to, make these huge changes to your decision process in places where you don't have enough signal to do that. So this sort of allows you to be a little bit more, in a place where you're feeling better about, So that's kind of the first thing that you can do. But, obviously, sometimes, the outcome has already occurred. And so now what do you do? And there's kind of three ways that you can handle this. I think it's really, really useful to do all three. So the first thing is, as much as possible, when you're trying to deconstruct a decision where the outcome has already happened, and you're deconstructing it with your decision pod, with the people that you sort of pulled in, to work with you on it, or with a coworker or whoever it might be, try this. And it's actually quite hard. Describe the decision that you had to make with all of the relevant details and the information that you had at the time that went into the decision. And do not describe it past the point that you had to make the decision. So let me give you an example of how hard this is. So when I'm reading an interesting opinion piece, for example, and I'm trying to get your input on this opinion piece, if you know what my opinion about the piece is, I've sort of told you the outcome already, right? Yeah. So I've infected you with my own beliefs about whether the piece was good or bad. Yeah. Now, I'm sure that I think this is not controversial, that the way that most people would do this is, hey, Ben, I read this really interesting piece about whatever trade, whether free trade is good. Okay. I read this really interesting piece that was talking about free trade, and it said blah, blah, blah. And I thought it was a really good piece, and he made a lot of sense. What do you think? Isn't that normally how the conversation goes?
It is. And this is part of our problem. We're here in the UK, we're divided because of Brexit, and we know what's going on in the US, and it's very difficult. And I think you talk about this, a study in your book where there was a similar sort of thing, results based on something or other, and in one version of the study, you can probably explain that better, obviously better than I.
Sure.
But when you bring beliefs, and particularly political beliefs or religious beliefs or whatever, then that objectivity goes away.
Right. So let's think about beliefs that would reasonably be called part of your identity. Right. So what this study was, Dan Kahan and his colleagues who are at Yale, he runs the Cultural Cognition Project. And this is what he did. He had a data table that was just looking at the effectiveness of a skin cream. Opinions about skin cream aren't particularly woven into your identity, right? So let's call this neutral. I mean, I suppose maybe for, Kim Kardashian.
Dermatologists or something.
Right, dermatologists, right. But for the average person, not a lot of skin cream, vehemence.
Yeah.
So anyway, so they just had a data table that you would read that looked at, people who used the skin cream, people who didn't, how many people's rash improved versus, whose didn't. And obviously you need to make a comparison to determine whether the skin cream was effective or not. So it's, how good are you reading those data tables? So they gave people that, and they divided people into whether they were good with that kind of data or not so good. So are they numerate or not numerate? Are they, mathematical or not mathematical? So they divide them into the groups of you're highly numerate and you're not so numerate based on their ability to read these skin cream tables. Now they also know, and this is a very large sample, it was over 1,000 people, and there's a wide variety, of political views. So you've got people who are across the political spectrum. And now they substitute instead of skin cream, it's now the relationship between gun control and crime.
Right.
So now views about gun control are woven into people's identity. They obviously highly correlate with what your politics are. So now they have the exact same people read these data tables. And what they find is that the people who are really mathematical, when the conclusion that you would draw from the data table comports with their views on gun control, they were better than the people who weren't so good with numbers, right? So they stay better when it comports, when it conforms to their political views. But here's the interesting thing. When the data does not comport, guess what? That effect goes away. So even for people who are really, really good with numbers, if the conclusion conflicts with the thing that they believe, they're no longer good with numbers anymore. Which, so it just interferes. So it's this really interesting thing. So now one thing that happens is we know that because of that I can infect you with my own beliefs. So if I'm talking to you about an article that I read, I read this really interesting piece. It was about tariffs and free trade, and the author said whatever, and I really agree with him. What do you think? I might as well not have asked you, because I've already given you the conclusion, and now you're going to be unable to give me any kind of read on the article that's going to have any fidelity. But this is the way that we normally communicate, is we always want to get to the end of the story, and the reason is that we feel like the end of the story is super relevant, right? It's kind of this problem of resulting. We think that the outcome is really relevant. So if I say to you, like, oh, I was in the sales negotiation, and this is how I was reading the room, and this is the information that I had about my competitor, and here's what my range was on how far I thought I could push it going in. And so I did this, and then I changed strategy in the middle of it because I saw him do something, and then I broke the sale. What do you think about my decision making? Well, the question is, why did I just ask you then? Because I told you how it turned out. Right. So you're going to make it conform. So what you want to try to do as much as possible is only describe the decision up to the point that you actually have the question. So, hey, I read this really interesting article on trade. Can you read it? Because I'd love to get your opinion. Period. Don't say what I think. Oh, I had this really interesting issue in a negotiation. I had gone into it, and this is what my strategy was, and these were the tactics that I was intending to employ, and this is what I knew about the other guy. And so as I was intending to close the sale at the amount that I had come into thinking, I saw him do this really interesting thing. So then I wasn't sure what to do there. What do you think I should have done? Period. Stop the story. Don't go beyond that. Yeah. So that's the first thing that you can do, is don't infect other people with the outcome and your own beliefs, because that ruins everything. The other thing you can do that's kind of interesting is you can take one group of people and you can say, hey, I was in this sales meeting and I was negotiating the sale and blah, 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 and I broke the deal. What do you think about the decision that I made? And then with another group of people, you can say, hey, I was in this sales meeting and blah, 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 and I saw this particular thing, and so I changed course, and guess what? I closed the sale for 20% higher than I thought I was going to. So you give them opposite outcomes. And what you'll find is that their analysis of the quality of your decision is going to be drastically different. That's a really important exercise to do, to reveal exactly how big an effect this has on you. And then you can actually take what the people who hear that it was a bad decision see in the decision process. And you can take what the people who think it was a good decision see in the decision process, and you can interpolate between the two. You can kind of marry them to sort of see what the good stuff and the bad stuff was. Because the fact is that there is no decision that's all good or bad.
Yeah. We don't, we often, as you say, we think in these extremes.
So we want to reveal both things, right? Like we want to reveal the kind of like the stuff that maybe wasn't so great. Maybe the people who think it was a bad decision, like really uncover something that was really kind of dumb about what you did. And so it turns out that the fact that you were able to, close it for hire turned out to be a matter of luck, something to do with the other guy that just had to do with the kind of pressure he was under, or, who knows, right? But something that you did wasn't even in your, you didn't even have under consideration, for example. It wasn't part of your decision process. Yeah,
super interesting. Yeah, that's a great exercise. I was talking to one of my previous guests. Her name's Kathy O'Dowd, and she's a mountaineer. And we talked at length about decision making on this episode, and she talked about how sometimes a mountaineer might, or a team of mountaineers might go and walk through sort of an avalanche area, and everything's fine, right? There was a risk of an avalanche, and they could have set it off, but they'll walk through it, and all of a sudden they think that was a great decision because the avalanche didn't happen. But it was, there's a form of luck, and there's a book by John Coates called The Hour Between Dog and Wolf that I love. I don't know if you've read that one, but it's a similar thing.
I've heard of it. I haven't read it.
You'd love it. It's a similar idea where a trader makes a trade in the stock market or in Forex or whatever, and it goes well, and all of a sudden the neuroscience, the dopamine kicks in, and all of a sudden they're more and more likely to make riskier and riskier bets just because they attribute skill to something that was sheer luck.
Yeah, and actually there's an interesting thing that happens on the downside as well. So,
right.
People have talked about what happens when someone is actually in the state of losing, right? So you're actually in the midst of a losing position that you haven't closed out yet. And the fact that can cause us to be very risk-seeking as we're trying to get out of the losing position, right? But similarly to, somebody who closes out a winning position, and now the question is, what does their next decision look like? And it tends to be riskier. Once you've closed out, okay, I lost, right? I just lost 5 trades in a row. I'm kind of done. I've closed the position out. I'm going on to the next set of decisions that I make. You'll see that very often people will tend to actually take on less risk. And the reason has to do with actually this sort of same thing in terms of defensive decision making, which has to do with resulting. It's like the pain of losing is so much that you're just trying to prospectively minimize the size of the loss that you could possibly take. You just don't want a whole lot at risk. You see this in poker a lot where somebody's, in a game and they're losing, and they're playing like a maniac when they're losing, because they're just trying to get back to zero. They're trying to sort of close that pain out. But now, the game finishes and they cash their chips out and they go home and they go to sleep. And if they've had a few losses in a row, you'll see that the next time that they come in, they'll be playing a relatively low risk style. So what ends up happening with that is that you'll see that they're trying to minimize the maximum loss they can take. But in doing so, they're also minimizing the win they take. So the way that I sort of look at that is like, if you have in sales, for example, you'll see people who are closing a lot of sales, but they're closing it for small amounts because they don't want to ever risk. They don't ever want to risk breaking the deal. And so that's very bad for your company in the long run, because they're obviously not maximizing on any individual sale. And it's very bad for somebody to be doing that. So they're taking a lot of really small wins, but they're losing you money in the process, but it's hard to see.
Yes. That's so much interesting stuff in all of that. But we talked, there was a third thing.
Well, that was the third thing was those two, was those two, go and talk to somebody who, and tell them that you won, see what happened.
Okay, got it.
Go and talk to somebody who tell them that you lost. I would add in terms of process for doing the scenario planning. So when I'm talking about, so how do you figure out what the possible outcomes are that could occur? We tend to be sort of natural optimists. And so if you do that process and you kind of let it run on its own, generally what's going to happen is that you're going to be too optimistic. You're going to have too many scenarios that actually work out well for you, and not so many that don't work out so well for you. And then your estimation of the good stuff is going to tend to be too high. That's just generally the case. Not for everybody, but that would be the general tendency. So one of the things that's really nice to do is what we really want to do is sort of uncover the downside, because that's the place that we don't naturally go. Like, it's just not our natural thinking style. So one of the ways to do that is to do what's called a pre-mortem. And this comes from a guy named Gary Klein, who's done really interesting stuff on sort of intuitive decision making. But I would tell people to go read some Gary Klein stuff, because I think he offers a very interesting perspective on decision making. But he talks about this idea of a pre-mortem. So we know what a post-mortem is, right? Like, you have a bad outcome and now you're trying to figure out why the patient died. And we kind of know what some of the problems with that are, right? That we're going to be sort of yanked around by already having the outcome. But it's kind of nice. What's really good is to do a pre-mortem, which is to say, all right, I'm thinking about this decision. Let me imagine that it doesn't work out. Like, let me imagine that there's a bad outcome of some sort and it doesn't work out for me. Why do I think that happened? And now what happens is that you'll start to reveal all sorts of interesting scenarios that could occur that otherwise you wouldn't have thought about if you hadn't gone to this place of thinking about sort of post-failure, like I've already failed. Why did that happen? It just gets you into the downside, and it gives you a fuller picture of the things that might occur. And obviously there's all sorts of good things that happen. In that one thing, it increases the size of your zone of disappointment, right? As opposed to your zone of regret, because the more of the downside that you see in advance, the less likely you're going to be living in, why didn't I see that coming? Why didn't I know? And then the other thing that it does for you that's really nice is the more complete your picture of the future, the more that you've identified the possible futures that might occur, the more nimble you're going to be as a decision maker and the less reactive. So let's call the zone of disappointment a place where you're nimble, where you've seen what the future looks like. And likely in that zone of disappointment, you have plans already in place for how you're going to react when those not so great futures occur. When you're in the zone of regret, you're just reacting because you haven't planned for it. You weren't thinking about what might happen, and now you're reacting. And what comes with reacting when you're in the zone of regret would be overreacting, which you really want to be careful of.
And you're not thinking about, you go to the next, whether it's the next game, the next hand, the next decision, and you're not thinking objectively about it, because you've got that recency bias, if you like, of, you're affected by that recent event, you're traumatized by it, so you're going to attribute a higher likelihood that something similar will happen again, and you'll play it too safe.
Exactly. Or you might, the other thing that can happen, as I said, depending on how close you are to the loss, is you might try to chase your losses. And you might just try to shut down the pain of regret by getting back to even. And in that case, you would be taking on way too much risk. So it a little bit depends on what the time spread is. If you're in if you're feeling the regret right then, if you're in that real hot emotional state, having just lost, you are likely to take on way too much risk in order to try to calm that emotion down. If you've had some time and space between the loss where your limbic system is a little bit quieter, then you're likely to try to not get into the losing position in the first place, and you'll tend to take on less risk. So it depends on what the time spread is, whether you're likely to be taking on too much or too little. But either way, you're not optimal for sure.
Yeah. The other thing that comes out in your book is just that it's in the title, right? Thinking in bets, and how powerful a technique that is. As you say, we're not very good at thinking in probabilities, but once you frame something as a bet, it changes it changes everything.
Yeah. So, the whole thing, I hope that you've heard in this theme that I'm talking about, is that you want to allow uncertainty to kind of bubble up to the surface. Right? So that we can see it, so that we don't think that we're playing chess, right? We want to recognize that we're not playing chess, we're playing poker. And in order to recognize that, you have to recognize the uncertainty in this connection between outcomes and decision quality. And so what does betting do for you? It causes all of the sources of uncertainty to come to the fore. So, as an example, let's say that somebody said, I think that by the spring of 2019, we're going to have found a way for a hard Brexit, a full Brexit, not this soft Brexit, but it's going to be a hard Brexit. And that's what I think, right? So obviously when I say that, I've declared that with certainty, right? Like I've just declared what my belief is. If you then say to me, oh, do you want to bet on that? Like what does that do to me? Right? All of a sudden I'm like, well, wait a minute. I didn't mean I was 100% that it was going to be like the hard Brexit, right? Like I didn't say for sure it would be by the spring. And now what happens is that when you say, do you want to bet? It reminds the person that you say that to, that any decision that you make is a bet, because really what is a bet? A bet is a decision that's informed by the beliefs that we have about a set of uncertain futures, right? A set of futures, not a particular future. That's what a bet is. So we think about betting as happening in casinos, with chips and things like that, but that's not really what the definition of a bet is. It's just there's some sort of chance involved and hidden information. The hidden information would be, the beliefs that are informing you, right? Because our beliefs are always incomplete. Right. So we have these beliefs. The beliefs are never can't ever be 100% because there's hidden information. That then informs the bet or the decision that we make. And that's going to be about choosing a particular set of futures that you think will, sort of across them work out better for you in the long run than some other set of futures. But there's never a guarantee of which future will occur. So when you say the word bet to me, it makes that come to the fore for me. It reminds me that there's no certainty. And so what are the kinds of questions that I start to ask? Well, there are questions about what the sources of uncertainty are. Why do I have this belief? What has informed the belief, and how much luck might be involved? So I start to think things like, well, wait a minute. Why do I know this? What's my source of information? Is there information that I'm missing? How sure am I of the belief that I have that's informing this decision that I've just wanted to make? What does Ben know that I don't know? That's a really good one, because that starts to get you to ask, to start to uncover, what are the things that I don't know? Like that's what is his perspective? What are his experiences saying that he has that I don't have? Here's a good one. That makes you ask, why might I be wrong? So we tend to approach the world saying, why am I right all the time? I'm going to figure out why I'm right. But the more useful thing is, why am I wrong? Because we already know why we're right. What we don't know is why we might be wrong. And that's actually what we're trying to uncover. And so that gets you to start doing that. So notice that once you say, do you want to bet? A couple things happen. The first thing is that I go, oh, wait a minute. I actually recognize that I'm not 100% sure about this. So it gets you to move into to use the word zone again, a zone of uncertainty, which is a better place to be because it's a more accurate representation of the world. And then the other thing it does is it makes you really information hungry, because now I want to go find out, like, should I be betting? I got to go do my research.
Yeah, and there's a similar, it's the title of Nassim Taleb's recent book, Skin in the Game. So you've put something on the line here, so you care more about it and you're going to take those actions to find out, to answer all those questions that you've outlined.
Right, exactly. And again, it gets you to think about these two sources of uncertainty. I mean, so for example, if I'm in America and I say the Democrats are going to take the House in November, there's the uncertainty that comes from like information that I might not have about the way that voting districts are drawn, whatever that might be that I might have to look at. But I also have to acknowledge that the luck element, that July is very far away from November, and that there's a whole bunch of stuff that might happen between now and November that how could I possibly predict? It's a matter of luck. I don't have any control over what the geopolitical events are that might occur between now and November. So I have to recognize that there's a big difference between me predicting that the Democrats are going to take a House in November when it's July versus when it's the day before the vote. There's a lot less luck when it's the day before than when it's months in advance, for example. And so when you say, do you want to bet on that? It causes me to start thinking about not just the uncertainty that comes from hidden information or the things that you might know that I don't know, or what the quality of my information might be and all of that. But it also gets me to start thinking about the luck element in a clear way.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very powerful. We've been going for an hour and 15 minutes or so I'm conscious of your time and I want to wrap it up. But before we do, was there anything that we didn't mention, or you didn't mention, that you wanted to discuss or raise?
No, I think, look, the fact that the minute that you asked me about the more defensive stuff, why aren't they pulling the goalie?
Right.
That's actually a thing. I've been thinking about that like a lot lately. So I'm just excited that we got to talk about it, because it's not, obviously that's not in my book. And because it's a whole other route to go down, it would create a whole, I would have had to add like 200 pages to really talk about that. So I was just really excited to be able to talk about that.
Likewise, this was great. But speaking of which, you mentioned another 200 pages of your book. Are you planning on writing another one? Have you?
So I'm in this kind of I talk about the power of saying I don't know in my book, and so I'm going to say I don't know. So here's where I am. I am actually working on a workbook to go along with thinking.
Great, yeah.
So, the thinking in bets is this really nice kind of layout of, here are the kinds of things to be thinking about. Here's where decisions might go wrong. Here's different ways that we're biased. Here's some things that you might try to do about it. And now I want to really bring that down into the concrete, from the abstract, and say, here's a whole set of exercises that you can do that's really going to help you to implement this way of thinking. So I'm working on that. Very, very high probability that I end up doing that. I just actually sent the proposal off. So I'm pretty far down the road on that. In terms of a book that comes after that, I am really interested in this topic that I've been thinking about the difference between, like, retrospectively, how are you working backwards from outcomes, to prospectively, how is your decision making being changed by thinking about what it's going to be like post outcome, right? By thinking about being in that place of regret versus disappointment, for example, being in that place of thinking about being blamed. What are the different ways that we sort of shield ourselves from that, right, in our decision making, or the way that we sort of like leaning toward consensus or that kind of thing.
That, as you were discussing, there was that, I'll send you the link to this Malcolm Gladwell podcast, but he talks about those social pressures, and there's a psychological trait called those who are, I think it's called amiable, or people who are liked, people who care about whether they're liked or not, and those who don't care, they'll be, as you can expect, that sort of down the line, super rational, even if it causes the outrage, etc. What the headlines say, they don't really care, so they'll just work that way. Whereas those that have that more of that trait, they will, I don't know what that's gonna, what are people gonna say, this sort of thing. So I mean, please send me the link, because I would really like to listen to that, because that's right in my zone. So I think, at least as it sort of stands right now, if I were to write a book, I think that it would be along those lines. But I don't know, because I just started putting together a proposal to go back to University of Pennsylvania and start working with Philip Tetlock, who wrote the wonderful book Super Forecasters, and Expert Political Judgment also. And he and his wife Barb Mellers are just amazing. And I've got a whole sort of program for studying a particular for an important thing in terms of decision making, which is sort of looking at some of the ways in which we sort of analyze the decision making leading up to outcomes in an uncertain system. So I'm sort of working out a decision, like a whole sort of research program for that. Right.
And so I know that's going to be taking up a bunch of my time going back to school. But it's I'm kind of excited about it.
It's a good opportunity. It's an amazing opportunity.
And then I have a bunch of kids that I really like to pay a lot of attention to. And I also have a business. I do keynoting and consulting and coaching on decision making. And then I also have all this nonprofit stuff, including one that I founded called How I Decide. And what we're doing is field catalyzing or field building around getting decision skills and critical thinking skills and, this kind of like getting more probability and statistics into the sort of the psyche of educators and policymakers and whatnot. We have all this information available to us now, and we're not teaching a lot of tools about how to think and think through, parse the information in a way that we think is really, really important. So I co-founded that in 2014, and I like to pay a lot of attention to that particular thing. People can learn about that by going to howidecide.org. And hopefully people will check it out because I'm very passionate about the mission there. So, am I going to write another book? I mean, I'm probably a favorite, but I don't know how much of a favorite. Certainly, the workbook, I would say I'm very, I'm in the 90s for that. The book that's after that, I know I'm really excited about the topic. That's what I can say. But, I have to see because I also have to recognize that I have a limited amount of time.
Yes. Yeah. Well, whatever decision it is, I'm sure it will be of the highest quality. So,
that I'm capable of in the moment.
Right. But, no, thank you very much for joining me. Before we go, you mentioned some links and places people can find you there.
Yeah.
But what are some of the others where your website, whether or not Twitter is a good place for people to follow you, that sort of thing?
Sure. So yeah, definitely just to reiterate, howidecide.org, which is the nonprofit that I co-founded. I would really love for people to go explore that. We're trying to get people excited about the need for that type of education. You can also find me at annieduke.com, www.annieduke.com. That's my website. You'll find links to the book there. You'll also find a link to my newsletter there. I send out a weekly newsletter where I'm really taking current events, things that are kind of happening out there, either in science or politics or sport, and relating it to the concepts that are in the book. So for example, the thing about the World Cup was I actually wrote a newsletter item on that, for example. So you can, if you go to annieduke.com, you'll see under, I think it's Annie's analysis, you can go and look at past versions of the newsletter. So you can go and you can look at previous newsletters. You can sort of decide whether you like that content. And if you do, hopefully you'll subscribe. And then it will land in your email once a week. And then you can also, if you want to hire me, you can hire me over on annieduke.com. Or if you just want to send me a note, I actually reply to all the emails that come in. So you will actually hear back from me if you just want to write and chat. And then the best place to follow me in terms of sort of my daily stuff is on Twitter, for sure. So I am very, very active on Twitter, just posting a whole bunch of stuff that I see kind of in the news. So Twitter ends up being a little bit of a newsletter light. So there's some things that are in the newsletter that never appear on Twitter. There's some things that I post on Twitter that get a much fuller treatment, in the newsletter. So they actually play together pretty well.
Very cool. I'll put all of those links in the show notes so people can find all of that great stuff. This was fabulous. I really enjoyed this. Thank you so much for joining me. And let's stay in touch. I'd love to have you back sometime.
Definitely. This was a lot of fun. Thank you.
All right. Very cool. Thanks so much, Annie.
Thank you.
So what did you think of that? Check out Annie and her book, Thinking in Bets, which, by the way, is available at Audible. So as a listener in the US or UK to the All Things Risk podcast, and as I mentioned in the intro, you can get a free copy of Thinking in Bets with a 30-day free trial of Audible. Check out the show notes for more. And I'd also love to hear your thoughts on decisions in any domain, which may be widely viewed as poor decisions because of their outcomes, but which in reality are quality decisions. Drop me a note. Let me know what you think. allthingsrisk@gmail.com is the best place to do that. And if you like All Things Risk, one thing that you can do to help us out is to share the show or leave us a positive rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you consume your podcasts. And subscribe if you haven't yet done so. You can find all the ways to do that at allthingsrisk.co.uk. That's .co.uk. We will be back in 2 weeks. Until then, and as always, don't forget, risk is life.